Hey, hope you're well. In this one, I just wanted to talk quickly about router bits or router cutters. I did a video recently about making shaker style doors with just a trim router, and I don't think I've ever had so many questions about the router bits that I was using and that I showed in that video, so I thought it was probably a good idea to do a quick router bits basics video. Now, some of this I have covered quickly already in the sharp and scary router bit video from last year. And if you want the absolute basics, the Cliff's Notes version, then check that one out. I'll link it up down below. But router bits are usually pretty simple pieces of tooling. There's a shank that's held in the collet of a router. The collet is like the chuck on a drill, but only for a very specific size. By the way, I'll be doing a router basics series of videos soon, so watch out for that if you're new to the world of routers or feel like you need a bit of a refresher on the topic. So there's the shank that fits into the router, and there's a cutting edge or flute, more often two or more, at the business end, the sharp end. Now, unlike the teeth on a saw blade that cut vertically through the material by spinning on a horizontal axis, the cutting edges on a router bit are more like chisels or hand plane blades, irons, that are fused onto the shank and cut by spinning vertically, so they're particularly good for edge work or for shaped cuts that need changes of direction. A straight cutter like this is about as simple as it gets, though. You buy one that's the right size for the work you're doing and that fits your router. You use it until it gets blunt and then you sharpen it or replace it. Simples. Staying with straight bits for the minute, there are also bearing guided bits that have a physical bearing in them that limits the extent of their sideways movement. Bearing guided bits are the perfect choice if you're making repeat operations that need to be identical when you're using a template or a jig, for example. A bottom guided bit, sometimes called a panel trimmer, has the bearing underneath the cutters, and it's used where you're trimming a surface to the edge of a panel. Laminate trimming, edge banding, veneer trimming and so on, where the bearing bears against the edge of the panel and the surface is trimmed flush to fit. It's worth bearing in mind as well that the panel trimmer can only be used for edge trimming because the bearing is at the bottom and it would get in the way of any other cuts. Even if you took the bearing off, it just wouldn't work. A top bearing bit has the bearing mounted on the shank above the cutting flutes and is also known as a template trimmer for obvious reasons. Because the bearing's at the top, you can also use this bit for non-through cuts like handle recesses, but you do need to pay attention to the thickness of the material, the template and the length of the bit. There are also double bearing cutters, flush trimmers like this one, that have both a top and bottom bearing and can perform both functions. I typically use one of these, this trend one, when I'm doing handle cutouts. Also, when using a table or bench mounted router, the bottom bearing panel trimming bit effectively becomes a template trimmer as the bit is upside down. One of the big benefits of router bits though is that they don't have to be straight cutters. They can be a wide range of shapes and sizes. In fact, there are lots to choose from. The trend catalogue that I have here, yes, an actual paper catalogue, has 280 pages in total, and over 100 of them, more than a third, are dedicated to router bits of different shapes and different sizes, different shanks for different collets. 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch and 8mm are currently the most common ones here in Britain, and also in different bit qualities as well. The more costly Pro range, for example, has a harder carbide edge and are ground slightly differently too, so that they last longer. Now, like all cutting tools, router bits will get blunt with use, and while they can be sharpened, when you sharpen anything, the size changes slightly. With a normal router bit, that doesn't matter too much because you're usually going to be making several passes, so slight adjustments can be made. But with a bearing guided bit like this one, a sharpened bit may be a slightly different size to the bearing, so you won't necessarily get a flush cut anymore. And this is where router cutters with replaceable tips or blades really come into their own, because you can replace the cutting edge without changing the size of the cut. The bit I looked at last year takes this to extremes though. Most replaceable tips are just a single blade, though they are usually double-edged, so you get twice as many cuts for your money before they need replacing or refurbishing. Of course, those bits are also more costly than a standard bit, but something I only learned recently though was that because it isn't being fused to the shank, the carbide in a replaceable tip can be much harder, so longer lasting and better quality too. Now, not all router bits come on a shank. Some of them, like the grooving or slot cutting bits that I showed in a recent video come as a plain bit with a hole in them at bore, and they need to be mounted on an arbor. Again, arbors are available in different shank diameters to fit the different collets, different arbor diameters to fit the different bores in the bit, and different lengths as well, both the arbor and the shank. Now this can be a little bit confusing to say the least, so let me just go through the grooving bit, arbor and bearing that I used for my recent shaker door video. I bought these bits a long time ago from Wilden Tool. It's not the most user-friendly of websites and forces you to bounce around a bit between pages to get what you need, but here goes. So I was using just a handheld router, so I wanted a smaller grooving bit from the standard range, not the heavy-duty range. Looking at the bits first, they come in 2 or 4 tips or wings, depending on the size, and you can see that there's a diagram here that tells you which column of figures relates to the thickness of the groove, the overall diameter of the cutter, the bore of the bit, and the maximum depth of cut for that bit. You can see from the bits listed that apart from the oddball one at the bottom, they're all 40 millimeters across, a 1/4 inch bore, and 13.6 millimeters maximum depth of cut. I said in the shaker door video that I like a 1/4 inch groove as it gives a bit of wiggle room with the 6mm panel, and you can see from column A here that I needed the T5464 6.4 millimeter bit. There's a link here to the bearings, but all that does is bring up a pop-up with this table, guide bearings for 1/4 inch bore cutters, which lets you select the bearing based on the depth of groove you want. I'm going for the 13.6 millimeter maximum, so that's the TB504 that I'm after. It's just that I can't add it to my basket from here. We'll come back to that. Let's go get ourselves an arbor. Again, on the arbor page, there's a drawing with the arbor diameter, length, and shank collet diameter, and the shank length. And again, it all looks a little bit overwhelming, but going through the columns, the important one for us is the shank collet diameter, and there are only 2 there that will fit my 1/4 inch router, either with a 26 millimeter long or 36 millimeter long arbor. I've kept it as short as possible with the 26 millimeter one. Longer arbors can be useful if you want to try stacking cutters up on the same arbor, but I wouldn't recommend that for a 1/4 inch shank, and never ever handheld. And finally, there's the bearing. We know it's a TB504 from the chart earlier, but we can also work out what we need with a bit of simple maths. The bit is 14 millimeters across, and the maximum depth of cut was 13.6. So 40 millimeters minus twice 13.6, or 27.2, gives you 12.8 millimeters, or effectively 1/2 inch, which is what the TB504 is, a 1/2 inch bearing with a 1/4 inch bore. Now, if you add all those to your basket, you've spent close to 40 quid, including that. But you'll not only have a bit that will last you a long time, this one's at least 15 years old and still cutting really well, but you'll also have an arbor and a bearing that you can use with other bits too, if you want to experiment in that direction. By the way, arbors typically come with spacers, so you can position the bit along the length of the arbor to suit what you're doing. Most of the time I have mine at the end of the arbor, as it lets me have more shank in the collet. Again, we'll get into the subtleties and the niceties of all this when we start looking at routers themselves in another video. Let's wrap everything up by quickly mentioning solid carbide router bits. I've mentioned carbide as the cutting edge of router bits, where you can get bits that are made entirely out of carbide, and as well as the obvious benefits of strength and longevity, it also means that the bits can be made more like drill bits with a spiral flute that will help bring the waste away, like the spiral upcut bits that I supply with my loose 10 jigs, or the opposite downcut bits that help prevent the workpiece from lifting, especially useful on a CNC with larger or thinner workpieces. Or there's specialty bits like this custom solid carbide bit for the Peanut 2 connector too. More recently, though, we're also seeing what are called compression bits, a combination of upcut and downcut bit on the same shank that's supposed to be the best of both worlds. I haven't used them yet, but I'm sure I will before too long, and I'll be sure to keep you posted when that happens. But I'll call this one done for now. Thanks so much for taking a look. As I say, it's just a quick whistle-stop tour to hopefully clear up some of the mystery around router bits and bearings, tips and arbors. If you've got any questions, leave them in the comments down below, and don't forget to keep your eyes peeled for that router introduction video. That's all for now though. Take care, look after yourselves, and thanks again for watching.